Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Dan Bourchier, coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Coming up, warning the price of fresh produce is likely to rise again with farms impacted by floods. The new national plan to end violence against women and children aims to achieve it within one generation, but how? And Chinese President Xi Jinping has laid out his vision for the country as he opens the Communist Party summit. Joining me on the panel, biomedical scientist Dr. Darren Saunders. Great to have you along.
G'day, Dan.
In Melbourne, international relations consultant and Liberal Party member Erin Watson-Lynn. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Acting editor at The Age, Bachelard. Good to have you here.
G'day.
And in Cairns, associate professor at the University of Wollongong's Ngarruwan Ngadju First Peoples Health and Wellbeing Research Centre, Marlene Longbottom. Welcome.
Wallawani.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're on Facebook as well. If COVID was the defining word for the past few years, surely water is the one for 2022, at least on the eastern seaboard. Yet again, tens of thousands of residents face being inundated or cut off from their communities due to floods, this time in Victoria, New South Wales and Tasmania. In Victoria this morning, the SES issued evacuation orders for residents in Echuca, Bumbatha and Charlton. And from Forbes, Western New South Wales, State Premier Dominic Perrottet announced that more than 30 New South Wales local government areas are disaster declared.
Over the coming week, particularly heading into summer as well, we expect more challenging weather. So we need to keep vigilant. We need to follow the instructions. As the Prime Minister has said, if it's flooded, forget it. You wouldn't drive into a bushfire. Don't drive through floodwaters.
Victorian Premier Dan Andrews also spoke this morning about residents dealing with the floods long term and the mammoth task of cleaning up.
My focus at the moment is supporting every community and every family to get through this as safely as we possibly can, to clean up, to rebuild, to recover. There's going to be many months where these communities will still feel the impacts of this flood event, and there'll be many people who are out of their homes for an extended period because of things like power, sewerage, water, repairs that need to be made to their own property and indeed some of the other civil infrastructure as well, roads and things of that nature. So this is going to be with us for an extended period.
And that roll-on effect is going to reach everyone. The Treasurer has flagged food prices will be hit as the affected regions produce much of Australia's food.
Dozens of communities in Victoria are in the grip of a flooding disaster that's unlikely to let up in the days and weeks ahead.
Here in the centre of Mooroopna, the water has been visibly rising. We're having to pull out of this town because it's just going to become too dangerous to get out later.
Here in Echuca, the Campaspe River is at major flood levels. Dozens of homes like the one behind me have been inundated by what were fast-rising floodwaters.
We're talking around about 7,000 properties that have been impacted by the floodwater.
Well, communities in northern Tasmania remain on high alert as more than 50 homes, around 20 businesses and huge amounts of community infrastructure were inundated in the worst flooding since 2016.
We've got a total of over 100 residential properties and businesses significantly impacted.
Around a dozen emergency warnings remain in place across New South Wales.
There are currently 75 warnings in place across New South Wales. 12 of those are at emergency level, but there are evacuation centres in place for people who don't have anywhere to go.
And so we can see that this is becoming even more widespread. Michael, Victoria, New South Wales, there is more to come as well in Tasmania. What does this spell ahead of the usually much busier summer season?
Well, I think a lot of mosquitoes from what we can hear, a lot of devastation for businesses. There are, in central Victoria, there's a massive amount of agriculture, including wineries, but also stone fruit and horses and sheep and so forth. So there'll be a lot of people. It's too early yet to assess the damage. I think there was more than $3 billion, $3.5 billion worth of damage in the New South Wales and Queensland floods recently. I think it's going to be similarly expensive and disruptive for people's lives over the next few months and going into summer. It's an extraordinary event and one that we're just not used to in Victoria.
Darren, acknowledging what the Victorian Premier has said today, that it's not a day for a conversation about climate change, about these bigger picture issues around risk mitigation, but surely at some point we have to find the time to talk about immediate crisis management and risk mitigation into the future.
Yeah, we do, and I don't buy that argument that today's not the day to talk about it. I think it's absolutely the day to talk about it because it's at the front of people's minds. It costs a lot to clean up and to support people through this sort of thing, not just people's in their homes, but agriculture, the whole thing. What we need to be doing is spending money and time fixing the problem, which is CO2 emissions and methane emissions causing global warming, which are making events like this more frequent and more severe. We know that's going to happen. It's going to cost more and more and more. We're already starting to see it play out in, concerts, outdoor concerts, not being able to get insurance. There's all sorts of ways this will play out financially, and just paying money to clean up the mess is a much more expensive way of doing it than trying to stop it happening in the first place.
Erin, is there another question here, as well as that, the big discussion around broader climate change about how do we prepare our communities right now for what seem to be more frequent floods, more ferocious bushfires and the like?
Yeah. Oh, excuse me, I've lost my voice today. But look, I live very close to where these floods were, right in the city of Melbourne. They were a matter of, I think, like 2 kilometres away over in Ascot Vale, which is very close to my home. And just seeing the devastation play out there, my heart really goes out to everyone who really are in my community. We shop at the same shopping centres, and it's really, really sad to see people go through this. And I think some of the things that we will see come out of this situation is realising how we aren't prepared, particularly in the city. I think that was something that really shocked people in Melbourne, was that this was, in Maribyrnong, in Ascot Vale, that's just down the road. These are relatively inner city suburbs. And, for some of their houses there, things like flood insurance. I was listening to ABC Radio this morning, like every good Melburnian, and I was listening to someone talk about the cost of flood insurance and just how much that costs. And if you're a person who's just bought a house and you're trying to save money because you've got this enormous mortgage, the last thing you're going to be thinking about, well, not now, but certainly before, was flood damage. There's a big conversation around, obviously, the Flemington racecourse and the implications of that flood wall. We know about that investigation.
We'll get to that one in just a moment as well.
But, these are the sorts of things that people in the inner city of Melbourne, and of course regional Victoria as well, these are going to be conversations that are absolutely forefront of mind. And I think Darren's absolutely right that now is the time to be having those conversations about climate change as well.
Marlene, there's also another discussion about the disproportionate impact on those that are doing it tougher, that have not have as much money in the bank, that can't get access to those insurances, not to mention the question around displacement. And we've seen this time and time again just in the last year, haven't we? Lismore, Cabbage Tree Island, where those floods happened to communities where there was a big proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and then there is not the same kind of rebound or focus on rebuild afterwards.
That's exactly right, and I agree that we need to start talking or centering the discussion around climate change, because this is a matter that relates to climate change. We've seen in my country, Ngarruwan country, the devastating fires, bushfires, followed by the floods earlier this year in Lismore and Cabbage Tree Island, and the displacement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people throughout the process, trying to get access to simple things such as accommodation, being refused on the basis of their race. We shouldn't be seeing things like this. So whilst some people are talking about access to insurance money, some people can't even get access to affordable accommodation and safe accommodation. So when it comes to communities that might be a little less fortunate than some, that there are issues that are really pivotal to addressing not only the climate change issue, but the access to services and providing really strong, adequate support and having Aboriginal communities at the table in the planning and recovery phase, and perhaps going back to Aboriginal ways of being, doing and knowing to prevent these things.
On those 2 points, can I get you to expand a little bit? Because on the one hand, about how we help as a society, how those people that need it the most get the assistance when they need it. What should happen there? Is there a type of mechanism or a lever that you think needs to be pulled? And then on the Indigenous knowledges, what do we need to actually be thinking about as part of the risk mitigation framework?
Okay, so first and foremost, we have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled services or organisations who provide services. They are pivotal in the planning and recovery of any type of disaster. We have lots of devastating things that happen in just natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, fires, all those sorts of things. So when we start to talk about what sort of lever needs to be included, it's really making sure that those organisations and those peak bodies, particularly the state peak bodies, are at the table with these decision-making processes so that that funding and whatever else needs to happen, planning, can actually come to the local level. In terms of Indigenous knowledge systems, it's important that we go back to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of understanding the weather, the patterns, the flooding. We have to understand those processes, and the only way you can do that is by having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at the table to talk about how do we move forward in the future planning process. And this is really important when we start to see phenomena that we're seeing now. It's part and parcel of making sure that we care for country and making sure that our country and communities are safe, and that includes listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, rangers in particular, who have experienced land management skills.
Well, and listening to voices is exactly what Victorian Premier Dan Andrews wants to do. He's announced yesterday that Melbourne Water is going to be conducting a review to assess the impact a 3-metre floodwater wall surrounding Melbourne's Flemington Racecourse had on the past week's flood event. The investigation comes after some Maribyrnong residents and MPs claim that the controversial wall, which kept the Flemington racetrack largely untouched by floodwaters, exacerbated the flow of water towards nearby homes and roads.
These matters were approved back in 2004, as I understand it. I think construction finished in 2007. There were expert hydrology reports, engineering reports. There was a planning process that was gone through. But let's have a look at this. Let's get Melbourne Water to review it, and I'm confident that they can do that. They can then present their findings, and we can make decisions based on that item.
Michael, this is shows a really vexing political and public policy issue, doesn't it? Because there in Victoria, the Melbourne Cup has a huge social impact. It's got a huge economic impact. What about the families, the communities around that as well?
And these are the kinds of choices that we're kind of confronted with when you have a changing climate. Do you build on areas that 99% of the time are fine, but 1% of the time are flooding? How do you judge the needs of a huge economic event like the Melbourne Cup, which is coming up on November 1, so quite soon, with the right of people to live unmolested by water in their suburb and their own streets? And these are the kinds of balances and conversations and studies that we need to kind of undertake once climate change ramps up or as it continues to ramp up, and we're confronted with these kinds of issues. I mean, the planning in Victoria, The Age has got a story tomorrow about this. The planning in Victoria is based really on outdated flood maps, on a fragmented system where it leaves a lot of the work to the councils. It's just not good enough, and we haven't paid enough attention to the consequences of some of the choices we've been making. Darren,
this also raises the ire of prevention being better than cure. How is that going to be looked at in this frame, or how should it be looked at, in fact?
I mean, I think what they're going to do in Victoria is important. You know, racetracks like to be great big flat areas. That also happens to usually be floodplains, and we've got racetracks in Sydney that are built on floodplains in the same way. And those floodplains in some way act as a bit of a buffer. You know, you try and jam all that water into a small space, it gets higher. And so I think what they're doing there is a really important review. But as you know, as Michael said, it comes back to competing priorities, right? How do you balance the economic and social factors of people's houses versus a racetrack that brings in all that money?
Mm-hmm. And that economic cost of the floods is adding to the economic worry list that seems to be mounting, facing Treasurer Jim Chalmers, who's just back from meetings with counterparts in Washington, D.C. This all comes ahead of next week's budget. The Treasurer says it's clear the global economy is treading an increasingly perilous path as both the US and the UK face recessions. Economic growth in Australia's largest trading partner, China, is also slowing significantly. The Treasurer, though, insists Australia's best defence against the threat of a global economic slowdown is a responsible budget. The UK Prime Minister had her own mini-budget to tackle some of these issues recently. This is all part of a bigger conversation, Marlene, about the cost of living pressures as well. Now, we know in remote communities that is even more exacerbated. What sort of additional pressure could these challenges in some of our major food bowls pose?
Well, the cost of living has increased phenomenally, even in a regional community like Yimoy, where I live. I've noticed a change in the price of food, fuel, all those essential items, and even rental prices. The cost of living has just gone through the roof. So with these added pressures, there's going to be more people who are requiring assistance for food, basic things that are human rights, you know, accommodation, rental properties if they're not, and perhaps even if they do own a property, you know, having to seek financial support in order to meet those repayments. It's definitely an area that you know, the cost of living is ridiculous in my personal view, but it impacts a whole bunch of different people at different ends of the spectrum, and those things aren't hardly ever taken into consideration when there's increases in, say, for example, fuel prices in the Torres Strait. It's absolutely ridiculous right now.
Mm. Darren, while all this is happening, and there's going to be more of conversation in Australia about food prices and those pressures, if we head to the UK, Liz Truss is facing an economic crisis, seemingly a brewing leadership showdown, and now there's this comparison with a lettuce that I think we've got some vision just here. Might be perplexed about what you were seeing. That was a live stream that is rolling in real time. Darren, what is it? What is going on here?
The bet is, can the lettuce outlast Liz Truss? The lettuce is looking pretty good still, I would say. It's looking reasonably fresh. I also think that there's an interesting, you know, from an Australian viewpoint, and I don't know whether the cost of lettuce went through the roof recently in the UK like it did in Australia.
It did here, yeah.
But it's a great parable for cost of living increases and the sort of skyrocketing inflation of cost of living.
And all this came about because of what, a news story that made a comparison to whether Liz Truss could outlast a lettuce, and it's now become a global thing.
Yeah, it's one of those classic, you know, off-the-cuff comments on social media, and someone goes and actually sets it up as an actual thing. I don't know. I suspect the lettuce probably will meet its match before Liz does, but maybe not by too much.
Yeah, well, it's certainly looking perilous for Liz Truss. One leader, though, who seemingly isn't worried about their leadership is Chinese President Xi Jinping, who's expected to secure a record third term later this week. Kicking off the Communist Party's National Congress in Beijing yesterday, he outlined his vision for the next 5 years in a speech that lasted 104 minutes.
The party has made spectacular achievements through its great endeavours over the past century, and our new endeavours will surely lead to more spectacular achievements. Yet the whole party, the entire military and the Chinese people of all ethnic groups stay closely rallied around the party's Central Committee.
His message very much one of continuity, lauding the country's COVID-0 policies despite their negative impacts on a slowing economy and promising to continue his crackdown on party corruption. The biggest applause, though, came on issues of national security, particularly those on Taiwan.
Resolving the Taiwan question is a matter for the Chinese, a matter that must be resolved by the Chinese. We will continue to strive for peaceful reunification with the greatest sincerity and utmost effort, but we will never promise to renounce the use of force, and we reserve the option of taking all measures necessary. The wheels of history are rolling on towards China's reunification and rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Complete reunification of our motherland must be realised, and can without doubt be realised.
Erin, you specialise in the Asia region in the research components of your work. There seems, as we heard there, that theme around continuity, not change. That's a really important part here. How much of this is about Xi Jinping looking to lock in supporters behind him and will have a free run of being present for as long as he wants?
Well, look, I don't think that anything that was said in that 104 minutes was a surprise, particularly around Taiwan and the national security issues. So China under Xi Jinping is increasingly inward-looking, increasingly nationalist and also increasingly expansionist. So I don't think that this would surprise, any analyst or any layman as well. And I think that for us here in Australia is that what we need to look at is the implications of that. And I don't think that we're unprepared for what China is going to continue to look like under Xi Jinping. So, for Australia, where 40% of our trade goes to China, now we don't necessarily need to pull back from China, but what we need to do is increase our trade with other regions as well and other countries as well. Now, we're already doing really, really good work in that area. If you look at our trade relationship with India and the track that that's on at the moment, and the IMF today said that they will actually become a top 3 economy. The rupee is actually appreciated in value against the pound and the euro at the moment. So it's a really interesting time for India. We've got trade agreements that can be revived with other regions as well. So I actually think that Australia is quite well prepared, and we've been increasingly well prepared over the last few years as we've looked at this changing nature of China under Xi Jinping, and I think we're in a pretty good position to move forward. But it's difficult for us here to say anything about what China should be doing domestically, what China should be doing with Taiwan and others. All we can do really is prepare. And we know we can really easily predict what the future is going to look like now. So that's not a bad thing for us here in Australia.
And I guess the interesting thing for me is around the reaction. Michael, you've worked in this frame right around the world looking at these big global events. Was there an element of messaging from Xi Jinping here to the rest of the world? And what do you reckon it was?
Look, I think Erin's right. It was a message around continuity. It's a message around, internal security and somewhat increasing external adventurism, although the rhetoric on Taiwan is really a reiteration of a long-term policy. It just kind of, the deadline is creeping closer and closer. For Australia, I think the message is I'm here to stay, and for the world in general, but Australia has found it more and more difficult to work with Xi Jinping. We've been subject to those trade boycotts. There's been those 14 areas of concern. There has been some move under the new government to kind of close the gap a little bit, but it's been, according to the Chinese side in an interview last week, frustratingly slow. So I think, it's in the very real sense, he's the devil we know and have come to know, and we're going to have to be dealing with him for quite some time to come.
It certainly appears that way. Darren, there was a lot made by the President around COVID-0 and this complete focus on that. I wonder, with your medical research, Adam, what did that indicate to you about the state of the health system or a broader focus on health there?
I think that's a really interesting one because there's clearly an economic cost to that COVID-0 policy. And at some point there must have been a judgment made that the economic cost of not having that COVID-0 policy would be much greater. I think to me it's a tacit admission that they probably don't have their vaccination systems sorted out anywhere near like they should. You know, the Chinese vaccine doesn't seem to perform as well as the other vaccines. And it's probably a tacit admission that they don't have the healthcare capacity to deal with a huge wave of COVID infections and what that would do to not just their society but their economy. And I think that's probably what that is kind of getting at. But at the same time, I think, you know, his internal message is, look how great I am, I've saved you all from this COVID monster. So it's a really tricky one, I suspect.
Marlene, those of us that aren't avid China watchers, that are just seeing this in terms of news snippets or in our social media feed, what are we to take from this speech?
I have no idea, to be quite honest.
I wonder if many Australians are feeling exactly the same way.
To be honest, I have no idea what goes on in China. I'm just struggling to keep up with what's going on here in our own country. So I try my best to be across a lot of different things, but in the honest truth, I'll leave that up to the experts on the panel.
And Erin, I just want to come back to you on this because we are about to see this new budget. We know that so much of our economy is tethered to what happens in China on global markets. What sort of indications does this give to you about where to for the Australian economy and the way that we do business?
Yeah, we are really headed into difficult times, and I think that Jim Chalmers has really signalled that to the Australian public, that there are going to be difficult times ahead. He's almost sort of warning people that, you know, when the budget does drop, that it's going to be a little bit, you know, it's going to be hard for people. And in a way, what I find really interesting from the political overlay to all of this is you're hearing this kind of language out of Labor that you might typically hear from a Liberal government, and then during COVID, the Liberal government spent their way out of the crisis. So it's this sort of role reversal, which I find quite interesting in looking at it from a political standpoint. So I think that there are going to be tough times ahead, and this government is going to have to make some really difficult choices. You know, we've got the G20 coming up as well, which Jim Chalmers will be going to, and we're not in this alone. A lot of countries are overexposed to China as well. So, look, there are some, you know, ways that we can cooperate around that with other, you know, bilaterally with other partners. But yeah, difficult times ahead, and an interesting flip to the political climate in Australia at the moment, I think.
Yeah, Michael, there's also this additional conversation about decarbonising and where China sits in that, because of course there has been rapid production of all the sorts of technologies that are required to decarbonise in China at a rate much faster than almost anywhere else in the world.
That's right. And I mean, China for some years has been saying that they want to decarbonise, and I think we have to take them seriously on that. But their demand for energy, particularly as they kind of industrialise and try and lift people out of poverty, has been so huge that they're basically applying every kind of energy, including coal and gas, to that, and the demand for oil is enormous and kind of to some extent drives the world economy. So it's look, the trick with climate change, I think, and I'd bow to Darren on this, but is if China can industrialise, develop, lift people out of poverty, but cut the link between development and carbonisation, then the world is in a reasonable position. If they can't, then climate change is just going to get worse and worse because there's such a huge population that we really need China to win this battle. So in that case, on that topic area, we should be totally on their side.
Darren, in addition to this, you've made an interesting point about the parallels or perhaps links between China and Ukraine and about maybe who's watching what at the moment.
I think it's interesting that, you know, everybody's attention is on Ukraine, understandably, and Russia. And I suspect what's going on in China has kind of just slipped off our radars a little bit, possibly been brought back into focus over the weekend. I don't think we can lose sight of what's happening in China because of what Michael and Erin were saying. It is such, you know, it's the panda in the corner of the room, right? It's a monster economy. It's a monster part of our economy and also our geopolitical security. But it seems to have slipped off everybody's radar while we're all talking about Ukraine. And of course, China has an important role to play in the Ukraine conflict because of their relationship with Russia.
Well, and of course, the media that we've seen around the Chinese president and the Russian president has been very interesting and somewhat telling as well. Well, back home now, and Is a pledge to end family violence in a generation even possible? That's the ambitious commitment made by federal, state and territory governments today as they delivered a new national plan to end violence against women and children. There's been no significant reduction in violence against women in recent decades. The statistics are utterly shocking. This is despite far greater awareness and pledges to shift the needle. The new plan describes violence against women as everyone's responsibility and focuses on the need to improve gender equality as well as engaging men and boys.
Only domestic violence or sexual violence has been likened to a form of terrorism. And while that is also a bold claim, if we think about our lack of tolerance to any sort of terrorism in our community, we say that there should be none. We aim to eliminate all forms of terrorism. Similarly, our ambition should be to eliminate all forms of family, domestic and sexual violence in our community.
Work is also underway on a specific Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander national plan.
Particularly from the Northern Territory, we are particularly very glad that it has a focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, because in the Northern Territory, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are 18 times more likely to be the victims of domestic and sexual violence. As a victim survivor myself, I want to thank every single woman that has been part of this plan. It's a bold and brave step that they have taken to contribute to this plan.
There are questions around whether the plan will come with any significant funding, and the specific action plans are still in development. Kate Fitzgibbons is the director of Monash University's Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre. She also led the consultation that helped to inform this national plan. She joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
What's your sense of the announcement and the release that we've seen today?
It was an extremely positive and, I think, collective energy at the launch today. There's relief to see this plan come across the line. It has been years in the making, but also we know that this is just the start. Tomorrow, the action begins on delivering that very ambitious goal to end violence against women and children in one generation.
And just how is that going to happen? Because we know a lot of the detail hasn't yet been articulated, particularly the funding structures as well.
What the plan shows us is that it's going to be absolutely key to look across the full spectrum. We need prevention, early intervention, response, recovery and healing. And that recovery piece is particularly exciting as part of the new national plan, because we've never before asked what it would look like to create the systems and structures necessary to support victim survivors, to not only survive the abuse, but to recover and heal and to thrive in their lives. So that's a really key component. But absolutely, the funding is critical. We have never had funding in Australia for violence against women that is commensurate with the size of the problem. Domestic, family and sexual violence is a national crisis, and we need the funding at the Commonwealth and the state and territory government levels to deliver upon this plan.
Can it be delivered upon in the 10 years that has been detailed?
We need to see measurable progress, and that's why the indicators have been built into the plan. So they've started to signpost what those indicators may be, but that will certainly be one of the key actions that needs to come out over the next 6 months. One of the frustrations at the end of the last national plan, which had a 12-year lifetime, was that we didn't see a reduction in violence against women, and we hadn't set up any measures for progress along the way. So we won't make that mistake again. This national plan says that we will be regularly checking in, collecting the data that's needed to measure progress throughout the 10 years so that we know where we are or aren't making progress.
And I guess those indicators are going to be very closely linked to outcomes, because that was one of the big criticisms, wasn't it, of the last draft plan under the former coalition government, that there just weren't those measurable outcomes, but there's still not the detail about those outcomes yet.
Absolutely. We're promised a national outcomes framework to guide the work under this national plan. So it'll be critical to see that that is developed in consultation with a range of different experts and stakeholders, and that we really lift measurements of progress out of the state and territory silos. This is a national plan, and we're going to all need to work together to achieve it.
Marlene, you very much work in and with Indigenous communities and having solutions from the grassroots, from the ground up, and being there at the table doing the co-design. Have Indigenous voices been heard enough in articulating where we are with this plan today?
We have been heard by pretty much because many of us have been very vocal over a very long time, over decades, and I'd just like to acknowledge the work that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women have lobbied for over those years of tireless effort, working towards getting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues around violence on the table. We've been heard in terms of a national advisory group, an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advisory group, although that work needs to be acknowledged as being started off by Associate Professor Hannah McGlade, who led the charge for that advisory group. So I'd just like to put that there. In terms of where to from here, I think it is promising. However, there are multiple areas where we still are not being heard. So we have national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander bodies like the Family and Violence Legal Services who aren't being heard or aren't included in those discussions, who need to be. So there is some movement, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And as it relates to closing the gap targets, the national plan refers to target 13, which is around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander households being safe. But the measures that they use for that target actually only look at physical violence, and we know Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women experience a broad range of types of violence. So it's not just the physical violence that we want to see. We want to stop seeing Aboriginal women dying as a result of violence. We want Aboriginal women to be safe in all our communities. We don't want to be the thing about financial violence, in the pre-run of the National Action Plan around the fact that the typologies of violence is very different for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women to non-Aboriginal women. So there needs to be a multi-level, multi-systemic process that actually includes everyone at the table, not just pockets of the service delivery sector, and not just people who appease certain political parties.
Marlene, can you expand on that, about the specific experience that you're seeing and hearing of Indigenous women and children in Australian communities? From your perspective, what does this look like?
Okay, so I'm a survivor of violence myself, so I live and breathe this stuff every day. I still have nightmares, I still have those sorts of experiences. However, the stories that I'm shared, or that families and women have shared with me, actually inform the recommendations that I've made about how we respond to violence. And that is a multi-sectorial, multi-layered, looking at things coming back to culture and including our men. And because, and I just want to make it extremely clear that it's not only Indigenous men who are partnered with Indigenous women who experience violence. This is all of a community. This is a lot of Indigenous women are partnered with non-Indigenous men. So they have a responsibility to come to the table as well. So when we start to unpack the issues around violence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, from the episodic level of how do we respond to a woman in crisis right here and now, to how do we meet our UN obligations, because this is a human rights issue and matter, that we need to ensure that violence across any community, whether it's a non-Aboriginal community or the Aboriginal community, is stamped out. Whether we will see that in 10 years, I don't know, but I would certainly like to see the indicator shift where Aboriginal women are no longer 7 times more likely to die due to violence in the 15 to 24 age category, or 9 times more likely to die within the 25 to 34 age category as a cause of death. So for me, in terms of what this means, this is very real, and particularly as I'm sitting here in Gimwe, I just would like to acknowledge the family of Crystal Ratcliffe, who was murdered and a few years ago, whose case was finalised in the courts this year, but it was a very long process, and the women that I speak to and the families actually share their lived experience about what it's like to go on after violence, but then what the families have to endure as part of this system. The other thing that I haven't touched on is whiteness and race. And we all also need to understand racism operates in a particular way in this country, and it holds Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women even further oppressed when it comes to accessing services. So when we're talking about addressing violence in our communities, we have to have victim survivors at the table, but we have to do it in a way that is culturally safe and is trauma-informed and responsive. Same way when it comes to higher level, looking at the strategies and keeping governments to account in terms of how is this National Action Plan going to be implemented, particularly as the state and territory jurisdictions have the carriage for the implementation of the plan. And then how do Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisations, whether it's a health service or a legal service, even a childcare service, how do they respond and how are they resourced in order to respond to if there is an issue in the community?
And I think you highlight there about the need for community-driven solutions that are fit for purpose for each community, not a blanket situation. Kate, I want to bring you back in on that point around the intersectionality of domestic and family violence and racism, and as Marlene just put it, the whiteness question.
Absolutely. This is a critical point that Marlene raises, and one that we have to confront, and we have to sit in the discomfort of talking about and calling out at every opportunity. What we heard throughout the consultation project that we did last year was the many disproportionate ways that particular members of the community experience domestic, family and sexual violence. This has to be a national plan for all Australians. So we need to ensure as we move forward in implementation that all Australians with a range of different identities and intersectionalities are resourced, are responded to, their recovery and their support and safety needs are privileged under this plan. If we are going to come close to achieving that goal of elimination, we can't just be looking at some members of our community.
And that inclusiveness is really crucial there, that has come through in aspects of the report. There's also been a lot of commentary today around that intersectionality for people living with disability and about the impact that family and domestic violence can have on either perpetuating, exacerbating or creating additional disability as well.
We know that women and children with disability are at significantly higher risk of experiencing all forms of domestic, family and sexual violence. And recent research conducted by colleagues and I, by ANROS, showed the intergenerational links where young people who have experienced family violence in the home and have disabilities, the high risk they are of going on to use family violence during their childhood. That is why the early intervention piece is so critical. We need to be getting in and working with children and young people as early as possible to disrupt the intergenerational cycles of violence. But we also need to ensure that our system is accessible, that it meets the needs of people with a range of different disabilities, that it's not a system for some. The COVID pandemic has shown us the ways in which we can pivot to deliver services online, to reach people in lockdown. Now we need to ensure that we continue to think creatively about how we can reach all members of the community that are experiencing domestic, family and sexual violence.
Darren, it strikes me that until we understand the answer to the question of why those cycles happen and keep happening and are exacerbated, how do we actually then come up with a solution that brings the community in together, that makes everyone responsible for this?
I think it's, I mean, as we've heard from Kate and Marlene, the factors, the underlying risk factors and drivers of this are complex. There is one overwhelming thing that we can't ignore in this, that the perpetrators of violence against women are overwhelmingly men. I was encouraged to see a small mention in the national plan around behavioural change around men, but that has to extend into societal norms. It extends to things, this exists on a spectrum. Everything from everyday sexist language to gender disparity to economic disparity, gender equity, all the way through to violence. And the people that really need to hear this message, you asked whether the voices of victim survivors have been heard. The people that need to hear it are men. Yeah. Men need to change. And that, that's not just individual men, that's the society that men exist in. It's the society that we derive our privilege from. And until that happens, this problem won't be solved.
Erin, how important is it then to have men at the table, but also to be saying to blokes, call out this behaviour and be the change you want to see?
Absolutely. I mean, it's just such a privilege listening to both Marlene and Kate talk then as absolute experts on this topic. I've actually sat here and really learned from you today. Look, I represent Australia on the W20, which is the women's working group or engagement group to the G20, and we look at economic policy, but increasingly over the years, part of that has been around gender-based violence and violence against women and how that intersects with the economy. And what's really interesting about the W20 is there is one man who is a delegate in all of the 20 plus one member countries in the G20, and that man comes from France. He is the only man who sits at that table and is part of the conversation, really wants to be a part of the solution. And the problem is that when you don't have men, unfortunately, the power structures are that if it's a group of women talking, it tends to end up being sidelined and they talk to each other rather than being embedded in that broader conversation. This is certainly at the international policy level, and I've watched that play out year after year after year. So men need to be welcomed into those spaces as well. I think that, for the average bloke saying, I wouldn't mind being a part of that, it might also be a scary environment to go into with a lot of women at the table, and that's okay. We can bring those women in. I really appreciate all of the work that France has done by having both men and women and other genders at the table in these conversations. But I absolutely agree with you. It's got to be, there's this huge cultural change that has to happen. I think every woman who, sitting here on this show or out there listening today has had some form of sexual comments made towards them, whether it's jeering in the street and then all the way through in the spectrum of abuse. So it's this is something that has to change. And for our kids growing up in this world, thankfully, I feel like kids out there are a little bit more attuned into these things today than what we were in the 80s and 90s when we were growing up. But we've got to do it for this next generation of kids so that they don't have to go through what a lot of us have been through.
Yeah, Michael, how perverse is it to hear when Erin's speaking there about when women are talking about this, they get sidelined. On the other hand, we know that when women try to break in, generally speaking, into the big conversations, politics, business, they get sidelined as well.
Well, that's right. And, in seeking cultural change in this area, which is absolutely necessary, and those mentions of kind of changing culture and changing male behaviour are absolutely necessary here. You're fighting against thousands of years of patriarchy, and it's a really big thing. There are incredibly ingrained ways of behaving that people don't even recognise are problematic in some cases, which we're trying to change here. So, I mean, I think that the fact that we haven't had a lot of progress over the past 12 years is a great shame. I think the fact that indicators and benchmarks are now being put to it, I'll be interested to see what they are, is a great thing. But I think it is quite optimistic to say that within this generation we'll end this kind of violence, domestic and sexual violence against women, because it is such an ingrained part of our society.
Yeah, such a huge challenge. But Kate, as you mentioned, we're not going to have a solution if we don't start having a really serious conversation. Thanks so much for joining us and for all your work on this so far.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kate Fitzgibbon is the Director of the Monash University's Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre. And if you've been affected by anything that we've been discussing, please call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or 1800 RESPECT on 1800 737 732. Federal Health Minister Mark Butler has ordered his department to look into reports that doctors are engaging in widespread rorting of Medicare. The Australian Medical Association has reacted with outrage to reports contained in a joint investigation by the ABC's 7:30 program, the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, led by award-winning reporter Adele Ferguson, that as much as $8 billion a year is being rorted.
Doctors charging dead people. So clearly they didn't get those services. Doctors who are giving oxycodone to drug addicts without due care. Terminally ill patients who, are really at the end of their life, and you've got radiologists, oncologists who are telling them to get radiation treatment really for money.
The story cites the work of Medicare billing expert Dr. Margaret Foe, who claims weaknesses in the system make it easy to rort and almost impossible to detect fraud. Dr. Foe heads a business advising providers on medical billing.
Doctors will be sickened by today's reporting, which is an undeserved attack on the whole profession, based very much on anecdotes and individual cases. The vast majority of doctors do the right thing and are working hard for their patients under tremendous pressure within the system. The AMA works closely with the Department of Health on compliance, and we have never seen any concerns or numbers that would support the figures reported today. We do not tolerate fraud, and examples of fraud should be tackled and stamped out. But the figures reported today are grossly inflated.
Drum regular and reconstructive surgeon Dr. Neelajana Raman says a broad inquiry into Medicare is what's needed.
I think we need all sorts of exposés on Medicare. I think a Royal Commission is not unreasonable. The thing that concerns me is that this, to me, doesn't read like an exposé. It sounds like a couple of Medicare lawyers who have come up with a number. We've heard this number before. There's not a lot of evidence to back it, and suggesting that some of the Medicare costs are related to doctors who are frauding the system. And look, I'll be the first to say that in our industry, as in any industries, there are unscrupulous actors. But like most industries, they are very, very few and far between. And as a profession, we try really hard to weed out some of these actors. And some people act maliciously, and some people, make mistakes because Medicare is an incredibly cumbersome sort of instrument to have to work with. I mean, the book for the item numbers that we have to bill is about that thick. So, in a combination of both malicious intent and accident, errors can happen. But in reading this piece, there are lots of things in there that concern me, because they don't seem like errors. If we're criticising GPs for not sorting out 4, 5, 6 discrete health problems in a single consultation, that's because there are other pressures on general practice, because we're not funding these long, complex consultations appropriately. And we're in a context where Medicare rebates haven't risen in over 20 years. GP practices can't reasonably see patients in this particular way. And sometimes it's not even appropriate to address every health problem in a single consultation. Sometimes necessarily the focus is on one problem or another. The latest Health of the Nation report suggested that actually 47% of GPs are underbilling, not overbilling, because they are worried about Medicare audit, because they are worried about doing the right thing. If we're going to have a conversation about doctors either intentionally or inadvertently billing Medicare more than doctors are entitled to, then I think that needs to be a very discrete conversation with very set parameters. It can't be using numbers like $8 billion that don't have a foundation and basis. You've got to actually understand the scope of the problem accurately before you can address that particular problem.
The Health Minister, Mark Butler, has since responded on Twitter saying, "We know the overwhelming bulk of Australia's doctors are honest, hardworking and comply with Medicare rules." But the Minister adds that he's now asked for an analysis of Dr Foe's work, as well as a report on the department's existing compliance, audit and professional services review programs. Darren, what was your take on this? And does this indicate that there is, as some have called for, a bigger review required around Medicare?
I think that's clearly what it says, and I think the Minister's response is appropriate at the time, but I'd like to see a proper, really big review into this. It's a complex system. I think what we need to be really careful to do here is not to throw all the doctors under the bus because of the actions of a few bad actors. What we've got here is a system failure. If these numbers are accurate and there is that much money being rorted out of the system, we need to understand why, and that's happening at a systematic level. There needs to be the right checks and balances in there to stop that happening. And I think Neela made a really good point there. You know, the system is under intense pressure. We're seeing that with the inability of people to get GP consultations. We're seeing it with the number of people leaving the profession and attracting new people in. And I think possibly part of what we're seeing is a reflection of that pressure that the system's under. And it's playing out in strange ways. And then you bring a profit motive in on top of that, and that just compounds the whole problem.
Michael, this was published by your outlet in collaboration with the ABC 730. What's the significance of this, and what do you say to the criticisms that we've heard today?
Look, the significance of this really is that in any large system of where government funding goes to pay for private providers to provide a service, there is always rorting. And the Medicare probably is one of our most popular, one of our most trusted systems. The people who are providing the service and taking the funds from it are doctors, who are, again, one of the most trusted professions in the country. And so, the scrutiny of it has got I guess quite understandably, some blowback. Now, I think Mark Butler's approach, which is to have a look at the claims and to look at them open-mindedly, is probably the right one. They are the claims of somebody who's an expert in this area, but they're heavily contested. But it seems to me that no system is perfect, and I've reported on many other sort of government-funded, privately delivered schemes, from the NDIS through to the vocational education training system, which have been rorted, and it's public money. It needs to be accounted for, and this kind of journalism, I think, is manifestly in the public interest because it's drawing attention to these things.
Marlene, we're almost out of time, but can you give us a bit of a sense of the way Medicare interacts with community-controlled health?
I think Medicare provides a broad spectrum of services that, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community health organisations try to make sure they access, but I think there's still parts of the community that find it inaccessible to access healthcare, particularly as Medicare, for instance, there's a clause where it can't be used, or certain elements of it can't be used for an Aboriginal community health organisation, say for instance in a prison. So we need to look at Medicare from the perspective of the people who are obviously rotting the system and the places and spaces where it is inaccessible or underutilised.
Yeah, it's certainly a big challenge there. Unfortunately, that is all we've got time for. Thanks so much to our panel, Darren Saunders, Erin, Watson-Lynn, Michael Bachelard and Marlene Longbottom. Great to all have you along. I'm back tomorrow. Until then, good night.